I have found even more value in the guy that's 1, 2, maybe 3 years ahead of me. I was talking to a builder, and I was very impressed with his portfolio, his workload, and I was like, "How long have you been doing this?" And he outlined the map of how he got to where he was, and he was 2 years ahead of me based on revenue, based on the type of projects, based on everything. And it was really cool to understand that, where it's like, man, in 2 years he went from where I am today to where he is today, and 2 years goes by in a blink of an eye. I got to keep charging forward here. Guys, welcome back to another episode of End Week. I was being interviewed the other day for an article they're writing about developers and builders in my area. And, we were talking about everything from my upbringing to getting into building, my passion for building, my passion for architecture, why I'm getting into developing. And, then the topic came up about social media and promoting and sharing everything I do through documentation, specifically video. And the question came up as, hey, when did you start with video? And it's interesting because it was, the end of year 2 in my business. Meg and I bought a home in Boston called Tucker. It was on Tuckerman Street. And when we bought it, we talked about how we should film it for a YouTube channel. And those of you guys know now, this gentleman Doug, who also produces this podcast, I went to college with him, and he lived in the same suite as me. And I had sent him a message on Facebook, and I believe it was Facebook. And I said, hey, would you want to come and film what we're about to do? I'd love to create some videos around it. And he was up for it. He lived in Maine at the time, and he would drive, God, I don't know, 2 hours or 2 hours plus from Maine down to Boston, and he would be on site with me while I was working. I was physically working on this home, had my belt on, and I basically was like, "Hey, come when we do demo, come when we do site work, come when we do framing, come when we," and it was just, more or less just a 1 day shoot. And he would film for 8 hours, and then at the end of the day, he'd have me direct the camera, explain what we were doing, and then he'd go home and he would create probably a less than 5 minute clip um, of 8 hours worth of footage. And man, I at the time it didn't seem like anything to me, but you know, thinking about it now, it's like that's so much content he was getting that just essentially was being wasted, because at the time he wasn't familiar with construction and enough to know what he needed to film and what he didn't. He was just capturing everything, hoping that he would have a bunch of good pieces. If you guys want to see the Tuckerman series, it's still on our YouTube channel at the NS Builders YouTube channel, way back. You can sort by upload date, and it's some of the first uploads we ever did. And it's really cool. But as we did a handful of them, truthfully, I couldn't afford to keep doing it. I needed to pay Doug for his time, which he was totally undervalued at that point. And we also needed to get the home done. My wife, was pregnant. We needed to get the home done. It just wasn't a priority. And I remember him doing another video for another builder. And when he did, I was scrolling through social media. I'm fast forwarding some bit here, and saw the video, and I realized that I thought it was my video because it sounded like mine. It opened the opening scene was like mine, and I was like, "Holy shit, that's not my video!" And I called Doug, and I was like, "Hey, I want you to come work for me full time." And I'd actually asked him yesterday in preparation for this, when that was, like, when did he come full time? So I'm talking about, uh, beginning of 2016 is when we were filming originally, and then he about 2 years later, April 2018 is what he remembers, he came on full time. In between that time, he had, um, he had done some other videos for us. He was filming some of our other projects, but it got to a point where it was just too much, and I ended up hiring another video company because I really wanted to document what we were doing. And this was also a similar time when Gary Vaynerchuk was getting really big, and I was really like infatuated by the way he documented his life, and I liked sharing what we were doing. And I didn't really go into it with a plan like, hey, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. I was just doing it. And I was like, hey, come document what we're doing. And this guy, Tyler, he owns a great production company, and he had a very different style. And I actually, I really liked it, but it wasn't Doug. And Doug had messaged me on Facebook and said, hey, at one point he was like, I really want to come and shoot for you. I want to do this. I'd love to figure this out. And like I said, fast forward to April 2018, made him that offer to come on full time. And, essentially since then, he's been filming, for me for forever. Like every week we're filming, we're creating constant content from B-roll videos, which is just kind of the behind the scenes, no talking, just like action and stuff going on, to the site visit series on our YouTube, which if you're not following, you should. If you're upset that we haven't been uploading every week, you should be. We want to get back to that cadence. At one point, I think we were uploading like twice a week or 3 times a week, and it was bananas. Um, but the truth is, it's just this we're always adapting. But I want to go back because, to that question, like, when did you start doing this, and also why? You know, I've really enjoyed sharing what we were doing for a number of reasons. I enjoyed the feedback. Probably, I wouldn't even say deep down, like at surface level, I enjoyed kind of promoting myself and positioning myself as someone in the industry that knew what he was talking about, and wanted to be respected that way. I also saw it as an opportunity for us to kind of catapult into the market that we wanted to be in, rather than have to grind for 40 years and eventually be the builder in Boston. And a lot of the guys I'm competing with in Boston, have been around and have been established for a very, very long time. And I respect that. I don't want to go through that when I have this opportunity to kind of position myself in the market at a faster pace, because of things like social media, because of the things like video. And and the other side of it is, I really enjoyed giving back and teaching how I did things, because someone else was teaching me, and for me to take that and share it, it was rewarding, because I knew I was helping someone. It was this collaboration over competition. And for me, one of the questions I get asked a lot on, especially consulting calls that I do with you guys, is like, who's your mentor? Who do you talk to? Who's your business coach? And the truth is, I've done, hundreds of episodes of this podcast. I talk to, hundreds of people a year on these consulting calls. I've built a network where I'm respected enough where if I reach out to another builder in this industry, they acknowledge who I am, and pick up the phone, and we have a mutually beneficial conversation where it's like, I provide value, they're providing value. So a lot of my coaching and mentoring is done, through a number of people. And, with that information, I'm learning from these people, and I want to turn around and teach someone else. Because, I think that generally speaking, when you think about who these mentors, there's a lot of guys that have done this for a very long time. They go to retire, and then they turn around and then they teach, and they become business coaches and things like that, which is amazing. But they're taking this kind of diluted, filtered down version of the last 50 years of their life, and then trying to implement that into someone else's business. And you tend to kind of shed the dead weight, and forget of all the negative stuff, and focus on what worked. Where I have found even more value in the guy that's 1, 2, maybe 3 years ahead of me, where I was talking to a builder, and I was like, man, like, you like, I was very impressed with his portfolio, his workload. And I was like, how long have you been doing this? And he had basically outlined the map of how he got to where he was. And he was 2 years ahead of me, based on revenue, based on the type of projects, based on everything. And it was really cool to understand that, where it's like, man, in 2 years, he went from where I am today to where he is today. And 2 years goes by in a blink of an eye. And I got to keep charging forward here. So I want to do the same thing. So the whole coattail where, there's a guy that's chasing me, or chasing where I am at in my career. And I want to be able to turn around and say, hey, go left, because I went right and it was a shit show. and and do this, and and yeah, I was at your stage, and here's how I would approach it. And it's very obtainable. You're looking at, you know an extreme example. It's like the guy that makes $1 billion, like turning around telling like someone that's making less than six figures, like, hey, you can do this. It's like, well, that doesn't seem obtainable. But the guy that's making six figures turns around and talking to the guy that's making 80 grand a year. It's like, hey, I made 80 grand a year, you know 2 years ago, and this is how I got to six figures, and this is how I got to 250,000, and so on and so forth. It becomes, it seems like a more reachable goal. And I'm going through this, I'm having this conversation, and I'm talking about all this, and I'm talking about how I love promoting our work. I also love the feedback. I love being able to put stuff out there, the good and the bad feedback. There's some bullshit on there. There's a bunch of trolls, which is fine. Like, side story, like that doesn't bother me. And it did for a long time. And then I completely took a page out of Vaynerchuk's book and was like, I'm just going to be empathetic to these people because they obviously have so much going on that they're just taking it out on me, and that's the way I'm going to take it, and so be it. And sometimes it's super obnoxious, but it is what it is. But there's some negative comments or correction comments that hey, maybe I did something wrong. So I want to make sure I'm engaging and understanding, like, how to improve. If I'm doing something wrong, I want to know that. So I'm getting real world feedback. I'm also, it's also an accountability side where I'm being held accountable. I'm almost forcing myself to do a really good job because I know I'm going to photograph it. I know I'm going to video it, and I'm going to post it, and people are going to look and try to rip it apart. And even the best photo or the best video, someone's going to find something wrong with it. And, and when you're constantly documenting everything you do, you have less of less of a shield around that, where it's like you're just filming and showing everything. And truthfully, when Doug and now Paul at Motif, you know, um, I'll come back to that in a moment, but now, well, what I was gonna say is, fast forward to just 2 years ago, we decided to separate, and Doug started, Motif Media, and we now have another videographer on staff. And that really was, it went from he was working for multiple people to only working for me, and now we're back to working with other clients because we've really Doug has really perfected the way we build content, especially for our industry. But where was I going with that? I just totally lost my train of thought. But what I was talking about, you know, oh my gosh, I was gonna say something about Paul. Oh, what I was, yeah. When they're making these videos, it's very rare that I'm watching the whole video to make sure that everything looks good. I'm not checking on it like I did for a long time in the beginning, but now I just trust the process. And trust me, there's times where the video goes up and I'm like, yeah, that's like someone's going to call something out in that. Or maybe there's, I mean, the reality is maybe there's a safety concern and we didn't catch it. And, and someone calls me out on it. The truth is I'm going to go fix that safety concern first. Because, I mean, frankly, safety is a very important thing. I'm not just saying that. We have a safety guy on retainer, and stuff slips through the cracks. That's just the reality. But we have a safety plan in place, and we have a safety manager that visits the job sites and makes sure that we're compliant. But I'm not always catching all that because I'm not filtering it. I'm letting them be the creative and create the content the way that they see fit. And I'm adding, my 2 cents into, like, hey, what about this and what about that? Um, the part I'm really getting to is I'm having this conversation. I'm talking about all this real world, or this very current, like, documentation and how we do this and why we do this. And a question came up was, what made you want to share? What was the point in time where you like, I want to share everything I do? And it made me realize that this all started way before building. And I'll bring you back to high school. And I bought this. 2001 Silverado pickup truck, regular cab short bed for my truck guys out there. It was 4-wheel drive and black. And fast forward, I lowered it. I put a souped up motor in it that I built. I did a bunch of work to it. I had, it was a fast little 13-second quarter mile truck. And I blew the transmission in it. And I pulled it in my garage and I looked at my friend John at the time. I said, I'm going to rip this apart and do a frame up restoration on a 2001 Silverado. And he's like, no, you're not. And I stayed up all night and I took that entire truck apart, bolt by bolt, piece by piece, and I stripped it. And to this day, 2024, it is still apart and it is still being built into one of the most obnoxious vehicles that will ever live. And, true to my personality, I suppose. But in that, I don't even know how many years it's been, I decided that I was going to document that journey. So here I am graduating high school and I'm in my garage taking my truck apart and I decide that I'm going to document my journey. And I remember that I was doing it because I liked to share what I was up to. Like I liked sharing what I do. I I wanted feedback. I wanted people to be able to help, provide feedback into what I was doing and making sure I was doing it right. And, and truthfully, I, I wanted the accountability of doing it. I wanted the accountability of doing a project like this. That Sorry, my camera keeps messing up. Doing a project like this, and something telling me, hey, you got to keep this thing going. So I was on message boards before social media was a thing. I was on message boards, and I would share the project through message boards. And interestingly, some of you guys on that listen to this actually know me from the message board GM Full Size, which is funny. But that was one of the GM truck forums that I was part of. And I started this thread and I said 2001 frame up restoration project Chevy, something along the lines of that. And I would sit in my garage and I would work on the project all night or all day. And then I would take my camera and I would take a bunch of photos of the work I did, and then I would upload them to PhotoBucket. And then I would take the PhotoBucket link and I would put them into the message board form. And then I would add captions of, look at, this is what I did. This is what I did. What do you think about this? Do you think I should do this or that? And I would just engage. And it became, the addiction of getting feedback and holding myself accountable to get this project done. And I remember there would be lulls where people would be like, what's going on? Like, why don't we get our weekly update? And I would feel accountable and I'd get out in the garage and provide some sort of feedback because people wanted more. And that was, something that I wanted to deliver on. And fast forward, unfortunately, let me tell you a little bit more about, because this is true to my personality as well. But so I took this truck apart, I stripped it down, I modified the frame, I was putting it back together. It was actually on air ride. I was putting it back together, and in that process, I learned a lot about chassis design and chassis geometry and things like that. So I ordered how I can remember how I did this. By the way, I also converted it to 2-wheel drive at this point. I believe at this point I drove to mid-state New York. I found a flipped over truck. I bought the chassis out from under it and I brought it home, and I used that chassis to build a new chassis for the truck because I didn't want to use a modified 4-wheel drive one. And I went through, I put it on I built a quote unquote chassis table. I welded it to it, and I modified the whole frame, and I started putting the truck back together. And I got to a point where I was getting so excited about working on this that I started joining other message boards and specific to like chassis building and things like that. And I started learning more. And when I learned more, I was like, man, like what I've done isn't that great. I'm going to do it again. And I cut that chassis up and I started from scratch and I built an entire chassis from scratch, the whole frame. I drew up the frame rails, modified them. I learned how to lay out control arm locations, toe, caster, camber, all of that. Understood how to lay out the the control arms in the front. I built a four link system in the back, which was called a satchel four link, which has triangulated lower bars, all adjustable. And it was getting to a point where I was putting the truck back together, and again, this is where people start questioning my sanity. I realized that I could do better. I could do better, and I cut off the front section of that chassis, and I had at this point drawn an entire essentially cradle that would be for all the control arms, engine mounts, everything. Um, I drew the entire thing in CAD. I sent it to a water jet company and picked it up from the water jet company, and the thing literally clicked together, and I welded it and slid it in, and everything bolted back together, and it was awesome. And I started putting the truck back together again. I put the cab on it. I found issues with the cab, and I was so frustrated with the issues with it that I ended up pulling I cut the cab up with a sawzall. I telling the story now, like there was a lot of time between these things. Telling the story now sounds like I'm definitely a psychopath. But I cut the cab up. I ordered a new cab. I put a new cab on. I started putting it back together. I got it to a rolling chassis, and I started making these like minor modifications because I just wanted to change little things. And I got to a point where I was like, this isn't right. I need to do this again. And I started modifying things, and I kind of I redid the back chassis and the back of the chassis for the rear suspension. And I was close. It was a rolling chassis, and it was at that point where I need to start thinking about the drivetrain. And that's when I got married. I had a kid, and it basically went on the back burner. I also started my business, so it just wasn't a priority for me, and I just couldn't sell it. And so fast forward, um, I've actually brought the truck up to a chassis shop, which is arguably the best chassis shop in the entire US. I brought it to him, and I said, I want to build I want to build exactly my dream with no exceptions. And I don't care how long it takes. And there was always things I wanted to do that I just knew that were way above my expertise. And he stripped the truck down, and he called me. He goes, Nick, this I've seen a lot of homemade chassis, and this one is pretty good. And I appreciated that compliment. And I was like, I respect that, and I appreciate that. And I know that it's kind of a waste, but I want you to do me a favor and just cut it up and get rid of it. I don't want anyone else to have it. I learned a tremendous amount, and I really appreciated learning about it. And I also really appreciated sharing that journey. And that really that was when I really decided, like, that's really when I started sharing what I do and documenting it, and not so much in video but in photo. And then you fast forward into the building. When I started my building company, it was all photo driven on Instagram. There was a point where Snapchat became really popular, and I basically would post on Instagram my photos, and then I would tell everyone, hey, go over to Snapchat to see the behind the scenes. And I would do these behind the scenes stories. And then of course when Instagram brought stories on, I locked into Instagram and went full force in that. But it I think that was a fun story to tell. I think that my point here is, there's a lot of benefits to documenting what you do. I look back at that message board and that project truck, and I see the journey that I went through, and I read some of the comments, and see the support that I had in this network. And I've actually met some really close friends that I still stay in touch with through that. And it's similar to social media nowadays, and what we're doing with YouTube and Instagram and this podcast. It's really allowed me to connect with some of, the top tier people in the industry that share similar interests, as do I. So, if if you're already documenting, great, keep doing it. If you're not, it's a consideration worth considering. Um, and for those that care, which I'm sure if you made it this far in the end week, you might, but that truck is very much still happening. It is at the chassis shop. We have designed a ludicrous chassis for it. And for those that uh, want to know, it'll be independent rear suspension. It is modeled off of a C7 Corvette suspension system. It is a custom billet rear differential, 6 speed, and the craziest part of it is it's all wheel drive. Um, and well, the engine's going to be a big engine, so it'll be very very powerful. And we opted to go with the all wheel drive to make sure that all that power got to the ground. It's going to be a fun truck. Like I said, there's no time frame on it anymore. And you know, I'm not the one welding it and fabricating it, but I am, at this point, kind of overseeing and guiding it very much how I have built my business. Where I used to be the guy in the field doing the hard work, the hard manual labor, and now I'm much more on the visionary side. So that little pet project of mine will be fun one day when I do get it done. Um, so yeah, hopefully that was a fun end week, a nice way to end your week, and I'll see you guys next week. See ya.